Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is my pleasure to dive into episodes each week where we lay the groundwork for what it means to connect with our communities and ecosystems and ourselves. And today's episode is no different. I have to tell you, this was one of my favorite episodes to record. Every episode is my favorite, but I just felt a really deep connection with Ben when we were recording this. And I think that is probably due to the fact that I had spent many hours reading both of his incredible books. Today's guest is Ben Goldfarb. He is the author of 2 books, most recently, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, and Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. I found Ben's book. I actually, most weeks I find a bookstore and I like to go through it, and oftentimes I'll find new or old titles that I don't think I would have otherwise, and Ben's book was on one of the shelves, and I dove right into the audiobook and just loved it. The narration was fantastic, and I thought that the idea was so beautiful. But what I couldn't believe was when I picked up Eager, his first book, I saw all of these connections and intersections and overlaps between the lives of beavers and the way that they have changed ecosystems over time, and the lives of humans and how our built world in the form of roads has changed ecosystems over time. And we really got to explore some of these big overarching themes between the 2 books in a way that just made my heart sing, if we're being honest. Before we get too deep, I want to pause and talk about a definition that Ben and I kind of circle around a lot in this episode, which is the concept of hyperobjects. Hyperobject is a term that was coined by philosophy professor Timothy Morton, who also has written many fantastic books, 2 of which I recommend are Dark Ecology and Hyperobjects. I also am going to include in the show notes an article that Wired did on Timothy Morton's work and the concept of hyperobjects, because Timothy Morton has kind of changed their idea of hyperobjects over the last about decade since it was published. But I wanted to pull back, and I wanted to pull both a definition from Timothy's book, Hyperobjects, so that we all kind of have this shared knowledge. So, in the ecological thought, I coined the term hyperobjects to refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. A hyperobject could be a black hole. A hyperobject could be the Lago Agrio oil field in Ecuador or the Florida Everglades. A hyperobject could be the biosphere or the solar system. A hyperobject could be the sum total of all the nuclear materials on Earth or just the plutonium or the uranium. A hyperobject could be the very long-lasting product of direct human manufacture, such as styrofoam, plastic bags, or the sum of all the whirring machinery of capitalism. Hyperobjects then are hyper in relation to some other entity, whether they are directly manufactured by humans or not. I think that this is kind of the seminal definition, but I wanted to deepen this a little bit further by diving into the definition within Wired magazine. And so in Wired magazine, They say, Morton was struck by a strange existential feeling, one that helped them formulate a word for phenomena that are too vast and fundamentally weird for humans to wrap their heads around. Examples of hyperobjects include black holes, oil spills, all plastic ever manufactured, capitalism, tectonic plates, and the solar system. Hyperobjects are often ancient or destined to be, like the sum total of styrofoam and plutonium we have littered across the earth over the past century, which will remain for millennia. A human being may see evidence of hyperobjects, pollution here, a hurricane there, but try gazing off into the distance to see the totality of them or to the very end of them, and they disappear into a vanishing point. Hyperobjects, as Morton says, emerge only in fragments and patches that do not always seem to connect up from our view on the ground. It's an enigmatic term, one whose meaning is by definition hard to grasp. It often seems more label than description, but it's precisely those squishy, elusive qualities that give it its explanatory power. The word hyperobject offers a useful shorthand for why threats like global warming are so difficult to understand or accept. They threaten our survival in ways that defy traditional modes of thinking about reality and humiliate our cognitive powers, a disorienting shift that sends many people reeling into superstition, polarization, and denial. Hyperobjects speak to the immense structural forces all around us and even inside us that we cannot see with our eyes but strive to comprehend through data or computer modeling. While they are not, in every case, bad things, the most talked about hyperobjects tend to be the most vivid and disturbing, particularly as they clip in and out of our vision like malevolent ghosts. Again, that's from the Wired article that I'll have linked below. And I wanted to give that definition because as we begin to dive into the idea of roads, which comprise somewhere around 40 million miles of roads around the globe, this object is just so big that it is incredibly difficult to understand. And when we look at that largesse through the idea of hyperobjects and the incredible work and storytelling that Ben has done in Crossings to elucidate how roads have changed ecosystems and changed communities and changed even just specific species, that the term hyperobjects actually comes really in handy. I find myself using it fairly often in talking on these podcasts. I loved both of Ben's books, and I think I said this to him, but I was talking about beavers to anybody that would listen and talking about roads to anybody that would listen. And I know that we've said this quote here before, but I wanted to come back to it. It was in my notes with Ben, and it just didn't come up. It's a quote that was shared with me by my friend James, and it's from Muhammad Ali. He says, "Looking at life from a different perspective makes you realize that it's not the deer that is crossing the road, rather it's the road that is crossing the forest." I think that is honestly the perfect lead-in for this incredible conversation with Ben, who was very generous with his time for me as well. I highly recommend you pick up both books. They are both great in hard copy and on audiobook. I know because I listened. And we have more of this kind of deep dive coming up this year. So expect some of these more granular explorations as we go through our year. And if you enjoyed it, if you can just hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to this podcast, it means that you are going to get those episodes every week where we are exploring some of these incredibly exciting topics. And I would so appreciate it because it also supports my work on the podcast and helps people find the podcast. So hit subscribe, leave a rating and review. But without further ado, here is the incredible Ben Goldfarb. Still unnerves me. I'm the most nervous podcaster ever. I don't know why I do this. It tortures me. I was telling you beforehand that I've really enjoyed being in your brain the past month, and it's true. I haven't been able to stop talking about roads and beavers to everyone that I talk to, and so I've been sort of trialing out some of the concepts of marrying these two books, Crossings and Eager, and kind of exploring where we might find the confluences of them as a whole. And so it's just been a delight, and I just want to say that.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate it, and I don't envy you spending so much time in my brain, but I'm glad it's been a fun journey and not a dark one.
I've loved it. I've just absolutely loved it. I thought maybe we might start with the concept of infrastructure. It's really interesting when I'm reading books. I'm often reading like 4 or 5 books at a time. And while I was reading both Crossings and Eager, I've also been reading Ed Conway's Material World and exploring supply chains of concrete, which I just find absolutely fascinating and dovetailed really well with the exploration of roads. And it really got me thinking about infrastructure as a whole and how both books, in many ways, are about infrastructure, both the infrastructure of this built world that we as humans have created and the infrastructure that beavers create in terms of dams. And these two creatures that are very different, that these beavers are acting as a keystone species and uniting ecosystems and building connection, and that us as Homo sapiens are really disconnecting and dividing with our infrastructure goals. And so I was just kind of struck at the correlations and the way that those things played off of one another. And I'll include this, you have this quote, roads so transmute our lives that one scholar has described Homo sapiens as an infrastructure species, an organism whose essential trait is that it is shaped by its own construction.
Yeah, I love that quote, which I believe is Jedediah Britton Purdy. I think you're exactly right about the connections between our two species. I think that was one of the things that attracted me to beavers in the first place, is just how fundamentally human they are in many ways, or how much we are like them, right? They live in these little nuclear families that is sort of the Norman Rockwellian version of the American nuclear family, with the mom and the dad and the baby brothers and sisters all hanging out together in the lodge. And of course, like us, they're relentlessly driven to modify their surroundings to enhance their own food and shelter and habitat, right? That's what we do, and that's what they do as well. But as you say, Kate, they do it in a way that is fundamentally beneficial to basically all other forms of life, right? They create these incredible habitats for trout and salmon and wading birds and moose and muskrat and otter and toads and salamanders. There's this incredible array of life that exists around the complexes that beavers create, whereas most of our infrastructure, and I don't want to say all of it, because certainly animals have figured out good ways of taking advantage of the structures that we create as well in some instances. But for the most part, the structures that we build are fundamentally inimical to other flourishing, and are profoundly detrimental to the vast majority of other forms of life on Earth. So I'm fascinated by both the similarities between us and beavers and the dissimilarities. The fact that, again, we're both ecosystem engineers on a really profound scale, and yet they do it in a fundamentally beneficial, positive, life-affirming way, and we do it, particularly with our roads, in a way that's fundamentally inhibiting life on this planet.
Yeah, I was really struck too by just comparing the two species, and I thought it was pretty incredible, especially as you explored the idea of kind of staying on infrastructure, William Lawrence's infrastructure tsunami. And I think you talk about this in the book, but I think it's about 3,000 pounds of infrastructure.
I think it's 3,000 tons. Yeah.
It is 3,000 tons actually. And Ed Conway in Material World says that there's actually a sort of inequity in tonnage depending on whether or not you're in the developed world. That it's about 15 tons per person in places like the United States and Europe, and can be less so in places like Africa. And so there is just like massive amounts of infrastructure that are associated to us. And I kept coming back to, I don't know if you know the work of Timothy Morton, if you read Dark Ecology, and their idea of hyper objects, that these objects that are so outsized that we can't really even fathom them, and yet they loom very large over our world. And I think that our infrastructure is one of those things, right? There was a article in Nature that all of the concrete in the world now outweighs the biomass on Earth. And so we really have created this massive ecosystem engineering here in the Anthropocene.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that, because my an early draft of this book had a kind of an extended meditation on sort of global road network as hyperobject, and it just felt like a little much. But it is right.
It is, exactly. Though. I felt that even if that wasn't in the book, like I kept coming back to that idea.
Good.
Of
well, I'm so glad that came across, despite me not mentioning it explicitly, and I really appreciate your close, thoughtful reading. I mean, I think that we truly have created a new place on this planet, or a new category of places, in our road networks. I think a lot about that, about the road as being this really discrete global ecosystem that resembles nothing so much as itself, right? That, if you think about, the ecosystems of North America, a sort of a temperate rainforest in Western Washington is nothing like, a desert in the Southwest, which is nothing like a hardwood forest in New England, which is nothing like, the Everglades, right? We have all of these incredibly discrete ecosystems, and yet they're all transgressed in some ways by roads. And roads are fundamentally like themselves, right? They actually have, a roadside in California, I think, has much more in common with a roadside in New York than it does the surrounding forest in California, right? You see the same types of organisms, turkey vultures and ravens and crows and other corvids and coyotes. And, there are always dandelions and, other sort of weedy, light-loving species along the verges, right? So, and it's sort of the same. It's obviously similar wind patterns and light patterns, and and it's influencing water in very similar ways, right? So we've created this globalized, totalized ecosystem that again is much more similar to itself than anything that it passes through. And if it's a hyper object, I think it's a hyper object in that way, and that it's a truly a vast, distributed, but ultimately very distinct entity, just as all of the plastic in the world, which is one of Morton's very famous hyperobject examples, is nothing so much like all of the plastic in the world, right? It's a vast, globalized, distributed, but ultimately discrete thing, and that's what roads are as well, I think.
Oh, I love that. And I think you say this in the book, but there are about 40 million miles of roads across the earth. Is that correct? So when we're talking about the largesse of this, I just wanted to give people a little bit of a
40 million miles of road. And you mentioned the ecologist Bill Lawrence, who's pointed out that we're also in the middle of the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that's headed mostly for developing countries in Africa, Asia, South America, and so we're going to add another 15 million miles of just paved roads by the middle of this century, which is to say nothing of all of the unpaved roads, right? I mean, the vast, especially in the developing world, I mean, probably 90% of the roads are actually unpaved. So we're adding 15 million miles of paved road, and who knows how many tens or even hundreds of millions of miles of unpaved road.
I mean, it's just staggering. It's just staggering. And I want to dive into the ecology some, but before we do that, I was really interested in the way that you framed first, and I think that this will likely come from a very American lens, both you and I being Americans, and sort of growing up in that space, but our sort of psychological connection to a road. And you talk a lot about the way that roads reflect our values, that they kind of show us who we are and who we were as they change and evolve through time. And I thought that this was really critical because it's not just about what roads do, but it is about how deeply embedded the idea of a road is in our culture. And I loved, you pulled this, you said, roads are both logistical essentials and cultural artifacts. They epitomize freedom. The quote, architecture of our restlessness, per Rebecca Solnit, who's one of my favorites. The quote, two lanes that take us anywhere, per Bruce
One of my
Springsteen.
favorites.
To us. Me too. To us, roads signify connection and escape. To other life forms, they spell death and division. And so throughout the book, you've kind of littered these ideas of how we view and interact and have this sort of psychology around roads. And I wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you pulled out that passage, because I often include that in readings, because I do think that it gets to exactly what you're talking about so perfectly, right? That we have this really deeply ingrained mythos of the open road in American culture, right? It's been celebrated by Kerouac and Springsteen and Prince, and I mean, of course, it's like so many of our sort of cultural touchstones, from rock and roll to beat poetry, sort of emerged in the middle of the 20th century, basically in simultaneity with the interstate highway system, right? And I don't think that's a coincidence. Mm-hmm. We suddenly had this massive new network of roads, on which to experience the country and to escape our parents and our hometowns and, get out there and see the world. And so it's not coincidence, I don't think, that, we created all of this music and art and literature that celebrated these giant new concrete structures that we had created to facilitate our own mobility. Although really, it's not like the American road trip begins with the interstate highway system, right? I mean, it really does go back to the advent of the car. In the book, I tell the story of, sort of the first car campers who were it was Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, occasionally, other writers and presidents and luminaries, this little group of car campers who called themselves the vagabonds, and Edison and Ford in particular, who were the two most famous Americans in the early 20th century, would travel around the country camping in, Pennsylvania and California and the Smoky Mountains and elsewhere. And the press would, sort of rapturously report on these industrial titans, returning to nature with the car as the intermediary that was allowing them to return to nature, right? So, in its early days, the car was this symbol, again, of not only freedom, but also interaction with the natural world. That was how we were going to get out there and see the country and be under the stars and so on. And so this idea that the car was inextricable with experiencing nature actually, sort of dates to the car's earliest days. I mean, you think about, our national parks, this kind of new category of place that, became increasingly abundant in the early 20th century. I mean, national parks have always been fundamentally automotive spaces. The vast majority of them have these giant roads running through the middle of them, and you're supposed to experience them, or maybe not supposed to, but, the primary way in which we experience them is as automotive tourists, right? So, there are something like 300 million car trips through national parks every year, and that's it's the kind of the paradoxical thing there is that cars have created this constituency for conservation and the preservation of nature by exposing Americans to all of these scenic wonderlands, even as those same roads and cars, of course, are in many ways destroying those places. So that was a kind of a long rambling answer, but it's where your question took me, which is that the car has in the United States in particular, and certainly this is not true in other countries, but it's definitely true in the U.S. that the car has always been how we've expressed our freedom and experienced the country that we kind of considered our national birthright. There are all of these campaigns in the early 20th century about seeing America first, right? Wealthy Americans, instead of going to Europe, should experience their own country, and the car was how you experienced that country. So cars are sort of fundamental to our identity as Americans, I think, since the early 20th century.
Absolutely. I even had to tease out just some of the ways in which I personally identified with a car. I mean, I remember getting my driver's license, and that felt to me like freedom, like escape, and like this sense of being able to be elsewhere at a time when I really wanted to be elsewhere. And I think that has carried forward into my adult years. And you actually have a quote, because I think this is really interesting. If roads denote freedom, any attempt to curtail their use is tyranny. And I was struck by that. And just too, I mean, I live in a rural space, so roads are very much an integrated part of my life, and travel by car. I think I even told you that I was listening to Crossings in the car initially, when I began the book. But I think that it's really important that we understand just how we all perceive roads and that travel. And I was grateful for that rambling answer, because I think it explains the ways in which we connect these sort of paradoxes that come up throughout Crossings, in the ways in which we connect to nature from this very disconnected space, and whether that's the paradox of seeing nature through your car, or roadkill giving us an opportunity to see a little bit more of species and their numbers and their disease loads, and all of these different things, that it was constantly this sort of bringing us closer while simultaneously pulling us apart.
Thanks for saying that, because those paradoxes and as you put it, the simultaneous bringing closer and pulling apart. I mean, that was sort of, to me, some ways the animating sort of thoughts driving the book were those paradoxes. The fact that, as you say, in rural spaces, and I live in one as well. Cars are they're not only, as I said in that passage you quoted, they're not only logistical artifacts, or logistical essentials rather. They're also, they're pleasurable in a lot of ways, right? That I live in rural Colorado, and we use our car constantly to explore the beautiful places around us. That's how we reach high lakes and trailheads, and and ski mountains, and all of the rest of it, right? So cars allow us to enjoy the spectacular place that we live in, and I feel incredibly conflicted about that. I confess that I kind of love driving a little bit, and certainly I do a lot of it. I probably drove 10,000 miles this fall promoting my book about the ills of driving, and felt often miserable while doing it, but also enjoyed it frequently. And that same paradox of roadkill that you mentioned too is something that I think about a lot. One of the places that I went this fall was I went to Austin, Texas, for the Texas Book Festival, and I was driving around Austin, and I saw a roadkill armadillo. Which was, an animal that, I'm sure that every Texan and Floridian and other Southern listening to this podcast, has seen a million of those, but I'd actually never seen a roadkill armadillo before. So of course I had to pull over and, and crouch down next to it and take pictures. And it was just, the most, of course, they're the wildest animals, right? That, they're just the intricacy of their armoring and their plating and their, little digging claws and their long tubular snout. They're just amazing creatures. And, and roadkill becomes the medium by which, I have the opportunity to get close to this animal that I'd really never spent time with before. And, and roadkill serves that purpose in all kinds of ways. I've crouched down with, great horned owls, animals that I'd only ever seen in the distance. And here's one up close with its, incredible claws and beak and beautiful plumage. Roadkill is I would guess that more Americans have seen, dead opossums than live ones, right? Roadkill is truly how we experience wildlife. And there's something, fundamentally, I think, incredibly pernicious about that. That we see these animals more dead than alive. And this is another kind of rambling tangent, but I remember.
No
Okay,
such thing
great.
on this podcast.
I'll fully indulge them then. Okay, wonderful. I was talking at one point when I was working on this book. And I don't think this made it into the book. I can't remember if it did or not. But I was talking to a friend, my friend Catherine, who has some experience in working in zoos. And what she told me is that one of the precepts of modern zoo design that I thought was really interesting is that zoo designers now attempt to put the human guests at eye level or even below the wild animals, or not the wild animals, the captive animals in the zoo. The thinking being that, if we see them as equals or even they're above us, we respect them in a different way, and we empathize with them, and we connect to them. Whereas, so and of course that's exactly the opposite of what the car does, right? The car elevates us on this little throne, and we, gaze down upon all of the lowly carcasses that we're riding over as we, bestride the ecosystem like a colossus, right? So I think there's something about roadkill that again, I'll say it's pernicious again, because I think that it does position us as conquerors of the ecosystem rather than members of it.
Mm-hmm. I actually think it's interesting. I did when I was a teenager, I did a whole series of photographs of roadkill. I was absolutely
cool.
fascinated. I've always been fascinated by anatomy and wanting to be closer to that. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at roadkill. But I think it's really interesting that you bring that up. It's funny. I've been reading Melanie Challenger's How to Be Animal, and kind of dissecting the sort of hierarchical position that humans often put themselves in with nature, and this idea of separateness from it, which I think, the car is this sort of literal embodiment, this vehicle, if you will, of separation and of being lifted from this. And maybe this is a good point to talk about a little bit about how roads truly change and divide ecology, and to just give at least sort of a bird's eye view, so to speak, since we're talking about perspective, of some of how deeply these structures shift ecology.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard even to know where to begin with that, because those that shifting is so vast and multifaceted and omnipresent. I mean, look, certainly, we've been talking about roadkill, right? And that's the most conspicuous, obvious manifestation of the ways in which roads distort nature. And I think in some ways, because roadkill is so ubiquitous, it's almost invisible to us, right? We've kind of desensitized ourselves to it. There are wonderful people like you who photograph it and go out of their way to notice it. But I think that's certainly not true of the vast majority of us. And it wasn't generally true of me until I began working on this book. And I think because we blind ourselves to it and encounter it so much, we actually don't really think about it very much. We don't really think about what a profound biological catastrophe it is, right? But we know that we're in the middle of this, what scientists have variously called, biological annihilation, or the age of loneliness, right? This period in which we're just extinguishing so much of the life around us. And roadkill is, in some ways, the primary direct way we do that. There's basically nothing that we do on this planet that kills more animals directly than drive, which is kind of hard to fathom. And I think that in part because the animals we see tend, just by simple probability, to be the common ones, like the white-tailed deer and the gray squirrels and the raccoons, which certainly are tragic deaths in and of themselves. But they're animals that are not going extinct anytime soon, right? We tend to discount roadkill, I think, as a contributor to this sixth mass extinction event that we're inflicting, right? But for so many threatened and endangered species, from ocelots to Florida panthers to tiger salamanders, roadkill is really, it is the primary existential threat that they face. So, I think that's a lot of what this book is trying to do, is just trying to make us see roadkill in a different way. But, roadkill is also just, again, as I said, the most conspicuous manifestation of this mass distortion of our planet by roads. You've got the barrier effect caused by traffic, right? This steady stream of
Mhm.
cars, the
The
moving
moving
fence, right?
fence.
That prevents animals from crossing highways altogether, and I find that really profound to think about, that a road might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's denying animals access to potentially millions of acres of potential habitat, because they can't even cross or they don't even attempt to cross the highway at all, because of that moving fence of traffic that you mentioned. And you see things like the genetic fragmentation of mountain lions in California, which are stuck, mating with their own close relatives, because no unrelated mountain lions can cross big freeways and enter the population. Or you see, herds of mule deer in Wyoming that starve en masse because they can't cross the interstate I-80 to reach their winter forage. So you have all of these invisible disunities as well, right? Of course, you never see the mountain lion who never attempts to cross the 101 because of the traffic, and yet, that's again almost a more profound form of fragmentation than roadkill itself. These animals can handle a few collisions in many cases. What they can't handle is losing access to all of the habitat they need to survive, because the fence of traffic has prevented them from getting there.
It's interesting too to bring into the forefront that paradox of almost seen and unseen, that there is this very seen and visible effect of road, and then there is this very invisible effect of isolating species, of not being able to migrate, and not having the genetic diversity that they need to really sustain. It just struck me there. A lot of the paradoxes struck me, and I have a couple more that we might come back to throughout this
Yeah, I
interview.
mean,
Um,
I think that so many of the other problems that roads cause are unseen as well, right? There's noise pollution, there's road salt runoff, there's tire particles
mhm,
bleeding into the environment
mhm.
and killing fish.
Yes,
Brake
brake
dust,
dust.
right? So yeah, I think that's a point that I try to be really clear on in the book, is that the book begins with roadkill in a lot of ways, because again, that's the primary way that we experience this disconnection between roads and nature. And yet, it is truly just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how this massive hyper object is changing our planet.
I wonder really quick, because you talk so much about the history of construction of roads, and as I went through this, I was really interested in the idea, and to bring beavers back in a little bit too, of circular economies. And I actually have a couple of quotes from the book that I think are really interesting, because one of the things that I was interested in is the way that road usage builds upon
Mm,
itself, that our very using of roads builds upon itself. And so I have two quotes, if you don't mind me reading
please,
for
yeah.
a second, just to kind of pull this idea in. So the first one is, all that clearing was not only abetted by roads, it also birthed them. The construction of new Cerrado highways and the paving of dirt ones had made it easier to bring soybeans and other products to market, driving up land values and enticing agribusiness. Highways encourage commodity crops, which justify highways, which encourage commodities ad infinitum. And so there was this example of how commerce, how commodities drove the creation of highways, which drives the creation of more commodities. But you also talked about this a little bit, just in terms of how we build roads in the first place. And this really struck me. You said, America locked into a road building cycle. Interstate highways drove sprawl, which drove lumber demand, which drove the construction of forest roads. Between 1946 and 1969, the service's road network doubled in size. Over the next 30 years, it nearly doubled again. The furious roading amounted to a massive subsidy. Taxpayers splurged on logging roads that wormed into public lands and allowed private firms to liquidate the people's timber. Where roads went in, trees, Douglas firs so straight they made fine sailboat masts, larches that glowed gold in autumn, Sitka spruce whose heartwood was stronger pound for pound than steel, came out. Roads fueled deforestation's business model. Often, the Forest Service paid timber companies to build roads on its behalf, essentially trading national forest trees for a forest transportation system. As the geographer David Havlick put it, some loggers admit that they make their profits only on building roads, losing money on the trees. And I want to come back around. I have another quote for you about circular economies that salmon create, but I was struck first at the idea that roads really fuel what felt to me almost like our built world circular economies, that roads beget the need for more roads.
Right. They're, I think maybe this is also a Bill Lawrence quote, but that they're spatially contagious, right? That roads breed themselves essentially. It's funny. So this book is about road ecology, right? Which is this giant field of study of how roads, this hyperobject, a word that I'm so glad you introduced to this conversation, because I'm going to keep using it. How the hyperobject of our road system shapes nature, right? And I think that one of the great challenges of road ecology that I really grappled with in the book is, where does it end? Because, truly, as you alluded to in the passages that you just read, every industrial activity is aided and abetted by roads, right? You can't illegally log the Amazon unless you have roads to get the machinery in and the product out, right? That the same is true for oil and gas drilling in the West, or now lithium mining, which is another kind of circular economy, right? The huge industry to produce batteries for electric vehicles, which will justify the perpetuation of roads and cars, even in the face of climate crisis. I think that's kind of an immense challenge of this, this field that I attempted to write about here, is that it just roads extend their little tendrils into everything, and it's incredibly difficult to say what ecological impacts are not caused by roads. The clear cutting of America's national forests, as you read about in that passage. That was not only sort of facilitated by roads, but roads were themselves the justification for that process in a lot of ways, right? The Forest Service had this kind of crazy construction credit system where it basically paid private timber companies to build roads on public land to get their trees out, and then the roads just became part of the national forests, and became part of our transportation network that private companies were paid to construct to as you quoted there, liquidate the people's timber, right? So roads facilitate the activity, but they're also they're an end goal in and of themselves, and it's really hard to tease the relationships apart, I think, because once roads are on the landscape, they don't go anywhere. They just have this way of getting used by humans and enfolded into our transportation networks. In Utah, they're still using roads that were Mormon pioneer wagging routes, right, that now become ATV trails and hunting roads and so on. So once a road is on the landscape, it's just kind of there forever. And so are all of the different human activities that the road facilitates, which makes it hard to say, what impacts the road itself is causing, because, on some level, it's causing every impact,
Yes, it's impossible to tease out. I actually pulled one of the quotes about Utah and the hoax highways, the all the different roadways that Utah likes to name, and a cow trail, it's a road, right. And wagon ruts, it's a road. I was struck by, you said something. You said they don't go anywhere. And I think that this is such an interesting comment to make, because I think that we view roads as the thing that takes us somewhere. But now with this vast network of roads, they don't go anywhere in particular, and they also don't really disappear. And I just want to tease out you having said that, because I think that that's just in some ways its own profound statement.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is going to sound kind of hokey maybe, but like they at once they don't go anywhere, and yet they go everywhere, right?
Yes.
I mean, you
Yes.
think about, I mean, we've been talking about the Forest Service a little bit. So the Forest Service is this giant federal agency that manages something like 190 million uh, acres of land in the United States, and also is the manager of the world's largest road network, right? That there's something like 400,000 miles of Forest Service road, a lot of them built by these timber companies we were talking about in mid-century. And
to the moon and
that's
almost
right.
back is what you say about Forest
Yeah,
Service roads.
exactly. Which is pretty hard to fathom, and there are many places in our national forests that have higher road densities than New York City, which is just kind of incredible to ponder. And so those roads are everywhere, right? In our national forests, they're ubiquitous, and yet again, they're not really going anywhere in particular. They were sort of built for these these industrial forestry purposes, back in the middle of the 20th century, and now they don't really lead to anything in particular, but they still get used, mostly by recreationists, myself included, and they're incredibly redundant in a lot of ways. I think that's kind of a remarkable thing to think about, right? And I forget which forest it is, and I forget exactly the statistic, but there's one study that I cite in the book, which basically shows that you could demolish something like 80% of the roads in many forests and not actually affect access in the slightest, right? You could still get everywhere because there are just so many roads, and yet 80% of the roads are essentially redundant. They're all, they're just kind of squirming around, like tapeworms in a gut, I think is, one of the metaphors that, or the similes that I use, right? So you can get rid of a lot of these roads and still maintain access to public lands. And so, I think that's an important point, is that, we can reduce our road density dramatically, and we need to, because we know that these roads have enormously negative impacts on some of our wildest places. They're bleeding sediment into streams and smothering fish eggs, and they're allowing humans, and we're sort of inherently disruptive, right? So they're letting us into critical grizzly bear and lynx and wolverine habitat, right? So these roads, despite being these little dirt squiggles in the middle of nowhere, are having enormous ecological impacts. So we need to get rid of them on a pretty large scale. And yet, we can get rid of them in such a way that we still preserve our access to all of the beautiful outdoor spaces on our public lands that we love to go, again, myself included. So, obliterating some percentage of our public land roads is not inherently, diminishing our access to these wonderful places.
Yes, and you talked about this principle, anthropogenic resistance, that the human attitudes towards something like the destruction of roads can really enter into this, which is some of why I wanted to precede this by talking some about our psychological relationship to roads, because I think that you cover in the book some resistance to some of those ideas, and especially when, and I think it is 80% redundancy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that it goes back to that, that cultural artifact connection that we were talking about earlier. I remember, and I think I mentioned this in the book. I remember going to this county commission meeting at this rural county in Idaho, and Idaho is sort of a place that I think is very attached to forest roads in a lot of ways. Lots of hunters and ATVers and sort of sportsmen who really prize those forest roads. And I remember being in the county commission room, and there are 3 framed pictures hanging on the wall. On the left, there's Abraham Lincoln. On the right, there's George Washington. And between them is a framed map of the county's Forest Service roads, which is just incredible, right? It's this very explicit evocation of roads as fundamentally American and fundamentally a source of human liberty and freedom, on a par with our founding fathers, so that and so when you explicitly connect roads with liberty, as you said earlier, any attempt to curtail their usage, is basically tyranny in your mind, right? And the Forest Service again is often closes roads and demolishes them, and those proposals to limit national forest road usage, tend to get a lot of pushback for exactly that reason. That hey, this is these roads they're our birthright. My daddy used these roads, and I grew up ATVing on them, and how dare you take them away from me, right? So these roads have been on the landscape for so long in many cases that they're just part of the social fabric of our lives, and we consider them essentially our birthright in many cases.
Mm. I think that's just vital to just understanding sort of the complexity of some of what you lay forth. I want to come back a little bit to the idea of circular economies, and I think that one of the things that interested me from my own psychological perspective as I was reading Crossings was my sort of I kept coming back to this desire to equate roads with, which are very much a part of the built world, the human built world, with these other spaces within nature. And, I think that there can be some folly in that, but also some interest. And so I kept coming back to the idea of waterways, especially through the lens of eager or mycelial networks, which I think form highways of a very different notion. And I always think, and I'll get towards the end, but in looking at solutions, of always looking at the way that nature builds things in its stead. And there was something really beautiful, because I want to come back to the circular economies that can be preserved. And whether we look at this through the lens of roads or through the lens of beavers, I'm not really sure. But I did pull this really beautiful quote where you kind of describe what a circular economy is through the context of salmon. And I do want to add here, your prose is so stunning that it makes both books just even more the delight to read. So thank
Thanks,
you
Kate.
for that. You say, no creatures, however, are as harmed by culverts as Pacific salmon, the aquatic world's most famous commuters, a group of fish that race up coastal rivers from California to Alaska. Born in freshwater, juvenile salmon spend anywhere from a few days to 2 years flitting around their home streams, slurping midges and dodging kingfishers, before their stripes fade, their flanks brighten, and they drift to the ocean to grow fat on krill, squid, and small fish. Some species, while away a couple of years at sea, others linger for 7. Eventually, they return to their natal rivers, attuned to magnetic fields and familiar smells and power upstream. They cease to eat. Their organs deteriorate. Some swim hundreds of miles inland and thousands of feet upslope, halting at last in high deserts fragrant with sage. With vigorous tail sweeps, females excavate gravel nests and deposit sticky orange eggs. Males joust for primacy and contribute milt with spasmodic shivers. Mission accomplished, they die. Their carcasses nurture eagles, bears, otters, mice. The nitrogen and phosphorus inert in their flesh nourish the insects that will comprise the matter of their fry. Their life cycle is a circular economy, a perpetual reincarnation. And I think as we talk about this idea of roads going nowhere, this idea of perpetual reincarnation is pretty fascinating in the circular economy that I think beavers actually contribute to positively, and things like roads and culverts in a negative aspect.
Wow. Well, thanks for reading that. That just makes me feel romantic about salmon all over again. I love salmon so much. And Eager has a chapter about salmon, and Crossings has a chapter about salmon. And I feel like every book that I write for the rest of my life will include some kind of salmon chapter, because they're just such extraordinary organisms for the reasons that you just explained. The fact that again they are truly they're fertilizing the same forests in which they're born. That circularity is just so, again, romantic and beautiful and powerful to me. And I think that's the kind of the grave injustice of roads in a lot of ways, is that they they break that circularity. The chapter in which that passage occurs is a chapter about road culverts, which are those crappy little, battered corrugated metal pipes that funnel streams through, under highways, or, often they're concrete as well. They're just like the most inconspicuous little structures that underpin our roadways, and we drive over 1,000 culverts every day, and we don't notice them or think about them ever. I think that lots of Americans don't know what a culvert is. I've actually had to explain the concept of a culvert on several radio shows and podcasts this fall.
Interesting.
Which surprised me a little bit, but they're just they're part of this. Culverts are part of this, this massive infrastructure that we've been talking about that, we ignore and take for granted, right? Just as we, take for granted that when we turn the tap, water comes out, and, when we flick a light switch, the lights turn on. And likewise, culverts are part of this unseen infrastructure that just undergirds all of society's systems. We just need a way to get water under highways, and culverts are how we do it. And yet, they are, despite being totally invisible, they are profoundly disruptive to nature, to fish in particular. Culverts, they're often too small, so they kind of concentrate the flow of the stream, and they turn it into basically a fire hose that a salmon going upstream can't really swim against. They get plugged up with sticks and debris and all kinds of things, and so they prevent fish from completing this ancient, beautiful, circular journey that you just described, and so I just find something so again just like unspeakably tragic about that, right? That that we have these incredible self-fulfilling or self-reinforcing salmon journeys that all of life in the Pacific Northwest has depended upon for hundreds of thousands of years, and those beautiful romantic journeys can be short-circuited by a culvert, which is like the most banal, humdrum, stupid object in the world. This crappy little metal pipe that you never notice, and yet that garbage little structure can deny fulfillment to these wondrous beings. I just find that there's something so profoundly wrong and sad about that.
It's interesting that you kind of couched it this way. I just did an interview with Dan
Cool.
Egan, who wrote The Devil's Element. Yeah, you're both on.
That's
you're
right.
both
We share an editor.
That book just absolutely fascinated me. And Dan has a quote somewhere, and he says, let's see if I can just pull it right up. In the last 200 years, humans cracked the circle of life held together by phosphorus and replaced it with a line running straight. And he goes on, but he says this multiple times, that humans have cracked the idea of a circle of life and made it a line. And I think one of the things that I have found this year in sort of the themes I've been exploring on the podcast and just in my own reading is our immense capability to do this, to take a circle and make it a line. And I think that looking at circular economies within nature are one of those things, and the way that I think beavers in many ways in their return have some capability of creating a circle once again, of resoldering that line into a circle in some cases, and also are very, very tied to the story of culverts as well. Culverts feature a lot in Eager as that place, but I'm just kind of struck by that, and I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it's just come up a lot in
well,
interviews.
that's a a lovely line from Dan, and thanks for citing it. I mean, it's and look, I mean, roads make that so explicit, right? What is a road geometrically, but not a line, right? So roads really do that, and it's not just that's. I'm just kind of thinking about about Dan's book again, which I loved, and I think that's what that's what so much of nature is doing, right? Is being circular. I mean, so much of, I think, my own book is about migration, which is a circular journey in a lot of ways, right? Animals are, they begin and end in the same places year after year after year, and migration is just this incredibly it's just an amazing phenomenon. It's just a remarkable way to kind of synchronize, your own life as an organism with the ephemerality of the resources that the world provides you. And salmon are one beautiful classic example of that. But I also have a chapter about mule deer migrations in the American West. And I've really come to just love and admire mule deer so much over the years that I've been working on this, this topic, and here are these animals that, complete these amazing circular journeys of their own, right? They're moving between their winter range, these low elevation valleys, and then they're going up into the high country to feed on the new spring growth, and the females are doing it while pregnant, which is just incredible, traveling many miles and fording icy rivers and evading predators and climbing mountains. I mean, they're just incredible organisms, and they have. I mean, kind of the amazing thing about mule deer and about a lot of hoofed mammal migrations is that these are really learned routes, right? That salmon are sort of salmon are basically instinctively returning to their natal streams, whereas deer are they're creating these incredible mental maps of their migration routes, and the fawns are following the herd, and they're learning where to go, and so you can think of these migration routes which mule deer follow with kind of incredible fidelity and consistency year after year as this form of intergenerational culture, right? That's passed down through the herd from doe to fawn over many, many generations. And, you can actually see that, the results of that, that intergenerational culture in the form of, animal trails on the landscape, right? And all of these hoof paths that have been beaten, over and over and over again over many generations, and are present on the landscape. And I'm not sure if you've read Rob Moore's wonderful book On Trails, but he's got it's such a great book, and it's the book that I was thinking about while writing my own, in a lot of ways. But he has a chapter in that book about elephants, which are incredible trail makers. And he talks about how these animal trails function essentially as a kind of a collective external memory for a herd of elephants, right? That guides them to all of the watering holes and food resources, and kind of takes them throughout their ancestral territories, and you just follow the footsteps of your own ancestors, and complete your circular journeys around your territory. And that's what deer are doing as well. So you have this beautiful mammalian circle across the landscape, and then you have this this insidious asphalt line that runs right through the middle of it, and short circuits the entire thing.
I'm fascinated to read this book on trails. I wrote it down. We'll have it in the show notes too. We always keep book recommendations there. But I'm really interested in this collective external memory, because as I was reading Crossings, I was thinking both about roads, but also about the trails that animals make. And I noticed that around my farm, my dog has little trails, little places where she constantly goes, and she's kind of compacted the earth there in these little trails. And my goats make some trails of their own as they head out to little places. But also, I do a lot of hiking. I use a lot of forest roads and service roads too, and just catching deer trails and wildlife trails that I know, as humans led us to salt, for example. I mean, you can always follow an herbivore's trail to find a salt lick, because they don't get any salt from their diet. And you can follow these different trails, and I know some of those eventually became roads in the United States. But it's very interesting just how different a trail is from a road.
Yeah. I mean that, and that alignment towards trails in nature, I think it's so deeply rooted in us. Like, I mean, my dog, like your own, is just she's incredibly trail oriented, right? And that's not something she learned. She just knows that, if you're, a descendant of wolves, a pack animal, you follow the pack, and the pack creates trails. And and so that noticing and kind of obedience to trails, I think is really deeply ingrained in us. And that's that's where our roads come from in a lot of ways. That's another one of these paradoxes we've been talking about, is that today highways obliterate animals, and yet in a lot of ways highways are the legacy of wild animals. So many of our roads began as trails, as animal trails. There's I mean, you mentioned salt licks, and I mean, and that's absolutely true, that so many highways follow the courses that animals took towards salt, especially bison. They're all, I mean, obviously bison are just these, enormous big bodied animals that, move in gigantic herds. And so they create these, these just incredible trails across the landscape. And they're like just amazing, pioneer accounts of, 12 men can walk abreast in the trail that the most sagacious bison carved through the landscape, and so those bison trails became native footpaths, which became, wagon roads, which became dirt and gravel roads, which, became paved country lanes, and then they became, interstate highways. And so our transportation network is it's kind of this palimpsest, all of these different sort of etchings of various human and non-human travelers over many thousands of years moving across the landscape.
I just want to highlight, you say this in the book, you use the word palimpsest to describe roads and this sort of layering and this evolution of values and roads. Actually, don't want to call it an evolution, but this sort of shifting idea of them throughout time. And I just want to highlight that because I think it's so fantastic.
Yeah, that's a word that I feel like I have been using like kind of incorrectly for many years, and I was avowed that in this book I was going to use palimpsest, and I was going to use it right, and so I just had to slip it in there, and now I can just casually drop palimpsest in conversation and feel really good about it.
I love words like that. Just like you want to use ontological is one of mine.
We'll work that in the next segment.
Okay. I actually want to come back to this idea too, because you can use this sort of collective external memory when we are imagining solutions for this. And one of the things I was struck by is that when you're building either underpasses or overpasses for wildlife to cross roads, when you are building crossings, that a lot of their success depends on that next generation that becomes accustomed to them being part of their migrational pattern and part of this sort of generational learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And I think that's happening on a couple of different levels, right? So, when you put in one of these wildlife crossing structures, there is a learning curve, as you say, and there's lots of research showing that it does take time for animals to use these structures, right? If whether it's a kind of an underpass leading under the highway, or a big bridge spanning it. I mean, those are not. I mean, first, they're not necessarily structures that animals have encountered before. They're not part of an animal's sort of habitual migration or its territory. So they're just not, an animal might not always encounter it. But they're also, they're not entirely natural, right? And, road ecologists try to make them natural by, planting them with native vegetation and so on. But, look, if you're a deer, walking, through a tunnel under a highway is not necessarily something that you've done before or especially want to do. So there's lots of research, showing that it takes animals, in some cases years to start using these structures, and one of the very famous, sort of networks of wildlife crossings in the world is in Banff National Park, in Canada, which is again, another protected area that is split in half by a gigantic highway, the Trans-Canada Highway. And, there starting in the 1980s, engineers built all of these wildlife crossings for, all of the critters that inhabit Banff. And, I think that for a long time, those structures were considered failures because mostly because grizzly bears didn't use them. Grizzly bears are sort of like the ultimate avatar of of wildness in Banff. They're the apex predator, and here are the animals, and they're very genetically fragmented by highways throughout North America. And so the goal was really to get grizzly bears to cross the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff using these structures. And bears they're smart, they're wary, they're really shy of roads and humans, and so for years they just didn't find and use these crossings. And I think a lot of people basically judged the crossings expensive failures. And then after a few years, bears start using them, and they teach their cubs to use them. And all of a sudden you've got bears going back and forth hundreds of times every year because they've as you say, they've learned to use these structures, and they've taught their own cubs to use the structures, and their cubs teach their cubs. And you have this intergenerational process of learning that allows animals to cross the highway successfully. And then that collective external memory starts to happen as well, right? That if you go to a wildlife crossing structure in Banff or really anywhere else, any crossing that's been present for a long time, you see these networks of animal trails converging on the crossing, as animals use them year after year after year. As Adam Ford, who's a great road ecologist who's studied the crossings in Banff, put it to me, it's almost like the entire landscape learns how to use the wildlife crossings together, because again, that external memory of animal trails forms over time. So there's both this kind of cultural component where the animals are, very consciously starting to feel comfortable using the crossings and teaching their own kin to use them. And there's this, potentially less conscious landscape scale transition where again that trail network forms and guides animals through.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating to think about that there. I mean, again, almost a palimpsest of sort of the different culturals and the sort of intercultural play and the way that these trails lead into it and therefore lead animals to a crossing that they might not otherwise, or they might be wary of use. I loved this sort of cultural and generational learning because I think that number one, it's always important to me, and something we're going to explore some more on the podcast is sort of understanding animal culture, and that we ourselves are animals with culture, but understanding non-human animal culture, and just how rich it is. And I think that this is a really beautiful example of that, and also of solution, which brings me to another paradox, which really does form so much of this book. And I have a little idea here, right? That there's this paradox that humans are the cause of a lot of this division and destruction by way of roads, but we're also the solution. And you have this passage and you say, and you mentioned earlier in the interview, this idea of biological annihilation. But this passage says, the chief irony of biological annihilation is this: we are both its cause and its solution. We so thoroughly dominate the earth that our conservation interventions, too, are necessarily heavy-handed. We introduce exotic species, then stamp them out. We poison California condors and breed them in captivity. We drain the planet's wetlands and excavate ersatz ones. If there is to be an answer to the problem of control, the journalist Elizabeth Colbert has observed, it is going to be more control. Having curtailed wildlife migrations with our roads, we micromanage the survivors. We shuttle them in buckets from here to there, fence off roadsides, and direct animals to the few narrow crossings we permit them. We built roads to subjugate nature, and by the time we learned the consequences, we had no choice but to subjugate it further. We are forever at war with the world we've built. And that last sentence, I think really... It weighed heavy on me. I have taken it with me past this book, this idea that we are forever at war with the world we've built.
Yeah. I mean, well, thanks for reading that too, because that's another passage that I think about a lot. And I mean, it's true, and it's true in so many respects. I mean, I think about I think about salmon, which we've been talking about, right? I mean, we dammed all of these rivers all over the Northwest, and our and then sort of belatedly realized that our giant concrete dams had kind of short circuited these ancient migrations, and just destroyed salmon populations. And our intervention was not to remove those dams in the vast majority of cases. It was to create salmon hatcheries where we could breed these animals in captivity, and dump millions of them into rivers, as though an animal that we breed in a captive setting could possibly be a sort of an authentic one. And now we're sort of coming to realize that actually those hatcheries have done a lot of harm in their own right. But again, like we just end up down these these kind of these spirals of heavy-handed intervention, where every action we take that harms nature leads us to another action that sort of further harms and subjugates nature. So we just end up down these in these kind of like feedback loops of destruction that all sort of begins with whatever the original sin was, whether it's building a highway or a dam or what have you. And I think that's, just to sort of return the conversation in a circular economic way to beavers. I think that's kind of the beauty of beavers in some ways, is that they truly are a tool of restoration, right? They bring back ecosystems that we've destroyed. Our interventions tend not to be restorative. They're kind of adaptive. Again, think about building a dam and destroying a salmon run, and then rather than restoring the free flowing river, the next action is to create the salmon hatchery that tries to prop up the population through artificial means, right? So we're not restoring anything. We're just sort of going further down this rabbit hole of heavy-handed subjugation and dominance of nature. Whereas returning beavers to an ecosystem, they truly put things back the way they were in many cases, right? And that's that's the beauty of them, I think, is that they just have this wonderful instinctive knack for restoration. And in many cases, I think that, and this is something that that restoration ecologists have written about extensively, is that we as humans, when we do try to restore ecosystems, we don't necessarily know what we're restoring for, because we weren't there, or at least, especially like the descendants of, us white people weren't there. Which is why so many restoration projects are now going towards native-led restoration, because there are these deep cultural and oral histories and memories of native restoration that we can obviously learn a lot from. But anyway, just to say that there are so many instances, especially in the world of stream restoration, where we've gone in with the idea of fixing a stream, putting it back the way that it was before mining or overgrazing, or the dam was put in, or what have you, and we've just done it badly and wrong, because we weren't present 600 years ago to know what the authentic original ecosystem looked like, and that's the beauty of beavers, right? Is that they were there, they kind of know, and they can put things back the way they were, in a way that we humans certainly can't.
I love that. And I was struck, I've worked a lot in regenerative ag over the years, and so understand a lot about the idea of ruminants and particularly bison as keystone species. But as I was reading Eager, I was absolutely struck by the power of the beaver as a keystone species, and just how much restoration it is capable of, and also how little we actually understand how different the United States looks because beavers were wiped out so early on, and that it transformed the landscape in a way where beavers restore it to something that isn't necessarily recognizable to us, but in the way that beavers also created the foundations of fertility in the way that those dams trap sediment and create almost a perfect milieu for some of those early agricultural conquests that happened in the northeastern United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, you look at, I mean, we just have to begin at the point where it's just hard to fathom how abundant these animals were historically. You know, that there were as many as 400 million beavers out there building hundreds of millions of beaver ponds, you know, modifying streams on a landscape on a scale that's kind of hard for us to comprehend. You know, there are amazing accounts from early trappers and railroad surveyors and explorers, you know, describing crossing, you know, what is today the state of Indiana and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had just ponded everything up. You know, there are accounts of trappers, crossing, southern Wyoming and northern Utah, you know, places that are desert today, and finding these incredible beaver ponds full of waterfowl and wild game and so on. And so, you know, this was just a fundamentally a much greener, bluer, wetter, lusher continent, thanks to beavers. And I think we just have not historically recognized that, because, you know, the trajectory of the destruction of these animals was such that, you know, the fur trappers, you know, and the fur traders were really kind of the vanguard of white colonization of North America, right? That the fur trappers came first. They wiped out everything, and then, you know, the farmers, you know, came in a few decades later in most cases, and by the time anybody was really, you know, making close observations of nature in North America, you know, the fur trappers had kind of done their dirty work, you know, and we'd lost beavers, and so we internalized, I think, this fundamentally incorrect concept of what a lot of these streamscapes looked like, because, you know, again, we just, by the time that, you know, most colonists and naturalists encountered them, you know, they had lost they'd lost their beavers, the kind of the landscape architects who'd created those ecosystems in the first place. And, you know, in many cases, we benefited from that eradication. You know, you mentioned the agriculture thing. I mean, that's, you know, kind of an amazing thing to think about, that, you know, when you trap out all of these beavers and all of those beaver dams break down and all of those beaver ponds drain, you know, you're left with this perfect fertile footprint of the old pond, you know, that's been cleared of trees and rocks, and it's, you know, it's got this incredible nutrient rich soil that beavers have been building up for millennia, and, you know, especially in kind of a rocky, infertile place like New England, you know, it was those. Yeah,
very.
Yeah, best. Right.
It's where I am right now. From Colorado, but I live in England.
So you know what a hard place it is to grow anything. If you had a beaver pond on your farm, you know, or an old beaver pond, you know, that was the best agricultural production you could ask for. So in some ways, you know, it was these animals and then the extirpation of these animals that made white colonization possible by creating the conditions for agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said something, you said you don't know what we're restoring for. And I actually, I'm going to harken back to the interview that I did with Dan again, because we were talking some about this idea. You know, you said that we can't comprehend what ecosystems would have looked like with beavers, that there were 400 million beavers. You know, the population of the United States is 330 million, just like for some comparison for people out there. And I think it's so hard for us to imagine on one side what an ecosystem would look like with the influence of beavers, because we're so far removed from it. And it's also hard to imagine what life would be like with fewer roads or with different road interventions. And so I think at both sides of the coin, you have this idea of, we're at this point in the sixth mass extinction event where we have to start imagining some things that are hard to imagine. And I come back to this quote often on the podcast, and it's attributed to Mark Fisher, but Mark Fisher attributes it to someone else, and I don't remember who it is, but he says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Yeah. And I think about how often it is easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is for us to reimagine some of the infrastructure that is currently in place, or to imagine ecosystems as they once were and what that restoration would look like. And one of the things that I think your books did so beautifully is provide a framework or an infrastructure, right? The definition of infrastructure is the underlying foundation or basic framework of what it would take to reimagine a news story of how we interact with ecosystems, both through the lens of some of our past folly and also through the lens of another creature's ingenuity.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully said. And in the case of beavers, I think one of the reasons that it's so difficult to imagine the future is that, look, we obviously, as we've been talking about, we have this incredibly interventive, heavy-handed relationship with nature. When we break it, we try to fix it, and we often do that in really heavy-handed ways, like the salmon hatcheries we've been talking about, for example. But the kind of the beauty of beavers, and I think the thing that makes them challenging in some ways to work with, is that they require a letting go of human control, right? That that the best thing we can do for so many of our degraded aquatic ecosystems is to get out of the way, and as the adage of the beaver believer goes, let the rodent do the work. Turn over restoration to this rodent that just sort of intuitively understands how these ecosystems are supposed to work and what they're supposed to look like. And again, that's just that's immensely challenging for us as a species. We've been told that we have dominion over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and so on, right? That we are dominant over nature, not subordinate to it. And yet, restoring it requires, again, getting out of the way and subjugating ourselves to beavers, and dropping some of this hubris that we have in adopting a position of humility towards the natural world. And that's kind of fundamentally difficult for us, I think, especially because beavers modify systems in ways that we don't necessarily recognize as being healthy and natural, right? That we have this idea of the perfect stream being this single thread meandering channel, rushing over rocks and so on, whereas beavers create these kind of complex systems of ponds and wetlands that are kind of hard for us to access on foot, and there are dead and dying trees all over the place, and it all kind of smells like decomposition, right? So we don't necessarily recognize the landscapes that beavers create as being profoundly beneficial, salubrious landscapes, and yet we know they absolutely are. And so we have to again adopt this attitude of humility towards nature and say, what, these animals know what they're doing better than we do in so many respects, and that's hard for us.
I love that. And I wish I had pulled the quote. I don't have it here, but you essentially say that humans, especially as engineers, really value order. And we see what beavers do as being chaotic or disorderly, when in reality, what it is complexity. And I think often as humans, a lot of the way that we, we've talked a lot about this on the podcast, a lot of the ways that the scientific and industrial revolution has couched things is in the idea of very reductive reasoning and singular ideas, but nature presents this incredibly complex interconnectedness that really defies the way that we tend to think about things, and beavers' ecosystems perhaps being that it is this network of something that we don't fully understand, but clearly is a force of unity within an ecosystem.
It reminds me of Dan Egan's wonderful quote, right? That we've taken the circle of life and made it a line, right? And that's when we think about the kind of the simplicity and order that we tend to crave. We like lines, we like roads, we like power lines, we like railroad tracks, we like our crops, planted in straight furrows, we like our big concrete dams, which are perpendicular lines across rivers. That's I'm going to keep thinking about Dan's quote, because I think it's so true. So much of our our world is linear. Linear infrastructure is kind of like a phrase that pops up over and over again in road ecology. That we've just we've taken this the messy, chaotic world that that beavers and other organisms create, and we've linearized it. And in some ways, uh, getting out of the way and restoring nature requires us to abandon our linear obsession, and permit some of those circularities that you've been talking about to take hold again. What is a beaver pond if not a circle, or at least a very irregular polygon? So it's the end of linear hegemony, I think, is like something we need to imagine.
Yes, I think, it's funny. Like I said, I'm usually reading 4 or 5 books at a time, and I'm also reading Ginny Odell's Saving
Cool.
Time.
Yeah.
And she really explores how we view time as linear, and when that sort of happened, and especially within the Industrial Revolution, and this idea of sort of linear clock time as both a means of progress, which I always think is a funny, this idea that we're progressing towards something is sort of strange to me. But linear clock time really changing the world, and also becoming a system of oppression. That the way in which this was put into factories and into workers, in order to make time as money. And so just all the different ways in which we have sought these linear solutions, and what it would mean to come back to that sense of a
wow.
circle.
I haven't read that book, but now I desperately want to, and I feel like you and I should co-author an essay about about down with linearity or something like that.
Yeah. I would love that. That's a lot of what we've been exploring on the podcast. I do want to touch on how you wrapped up Crossings as we begin to wrap up the interview, because we talk a lot about the disconnection that we experience through nature, or even the connection that we feel that we experience it through the vehicle. But you wrap this up in exploring some of how roads have disconnected us as people too, just between one another. And so I did want to touch on that before we begin to wrap up.
Yeah, I think that's a really that was a really important point for me to explore. In some ways, look, we talked earlier in this conversation about roads as these symbols of human freedom and mobility, and they get us around, and yet when you're stuck in bumper to bumper traffic on I-90, you don't feel very free, right? That they really kind of curtail our lives, and they curtail our lives in so many similar ways as they curtail wild animals' lives, right? That the same. I mean, look, we become, we don't call it roadkill, right? But obviously cars are an enormous source of direct mortality for us. 40,000 Americans are killed by cars every year, which is an unfathomable number. Road noise, which is also this profound form of habitat loss for songbirds and other animals, is taking years off of our lives by elevating our blood pressures and cortisol levels. We know that air pollution is obviously from cars is obviously a huge source of illness, and just as highways have kind of fragmented wild ecosystems, they've also fragmented human communities and cities, and in so many cases that was very deliberate, and the final chapter of the book is about sort of the history of urban freeway construction in the United States, in which so many urban highways were very deliberately plowed through communities of color in cities like Minneapolis and Miami and LA and Syracuse. I mean, you name an American city, and there was probably a mid-century urban freeway that was deliberately used to or weaponized against a community of color somewhere. And so I think that's an important point that I try to make in the book, is that roads for all of their sort of, economic benefits, and certainly they are helpful to us in so many ways, they also are, they harm our lives in all kinds of ways as well. And yet they don't harm all of our lives equally, right? Because they have been, deliberately weaponized against people of color. And, in the legacy of that, all of that racist infrastructure, that racist mid-century infrastructure, really carries on today. And, you can see the legacy of redlining and, and where our highways go. So, I think that was, a really, I think my editor and I both felt like that was a really important connection to draw, because, in some ways, we're in the middle of this broader national conversation about infrastructure, right? That, that I think that our conversation is, is sort of circling around or alluding to, which is that, we're starting to notice these systems, and, we as a society are starting to notice these systems in a new way. And we're starting to notice the hidden meaning of these systems in a lot of ways, right? That I think for a long time, the notion that, something as banal as a strip of asphalt could be racist was, sort of nonsensical to a lot of people. And yet, we're thanks in part to the big 2021 Federal Infrastructure Act, which sort of catalyzed a lot of infrastructure conversations. We're starting to say, oh yeah, these hidden systems that govern our lives carry all of this historical and cultural weight. And they, they're freighted with, hidden significances and meanings, and, and yes, a freeway can be a sort of a fundamentally racist structure if that was its original intent, as was the case in so many ways. And so, I think that one of my goals in this book was positioning road ecology and roads' impacts on nature in part of that as part of that conversation. Just as roads can be racist, they can also be these enormous forces of disunity and fragmentation, even though we think of them as connectors. They have all of these hidden ecological meanings, as well as, hidden cultural meanings. We return to the salmon we've been talking about, and all of those culverts that deny salmon the ability to complete their migrations. Well, those culverts are an enormous environmental justice issue, insofar as, all of the native tribes of the Pacific Northwest are sort of culturally and from a subsistence perspective, really dependent upon salmon, and salmon are integral to their lives and histories. And so, when our roads prevent salmon from completing their migration, we've not only committed an ecological wrong, we've committed a profound environmental justice wrong as well. And so that, I think that was really my goal in this book, was to tease out the connections between how roads affect nature and how they affect our own lives as human beings, and, how we're beginning to see our infrastructure in a new way, and hopefully thinking about remedies.
Yes. Remedies, reparations, and a sense of bringing a sense of empathy into that space, as I know one thing that you had said, and I do think we are beginning to view infrastructure in a different way, and to even consider it. I think for what you said, this is so much an invisible force, and so the question is how do we make it visible? And I think that you have done an incredible job of making it visible within Crossings, and really exploring that. So I'm really grateful. I think we've had a great conversation, but I want to know if there's anything that you feel like I've sorely missed, because I think that this is a good place of looking forward to infrastructure to kind of begin to
No, I
wrap it
think,
up.
okay, this has been an incredibly rich, interesting conversation, and I'm just grateful for your close reading and thoughtful questions, and for for bringing hyper objects into the conversation, which I loved talking about. I had the chance. I wrote I wrote a story about hyper objects. Well, we can just. I don't need to get into this. You can just cut that. I'll just say thank you so much for the really great, thoughtful questions, and for bringing the hyper objects into the conversation, because that was, again, something that I was in an early draft of the book, and then I kind of got away from, but I'm always thinking about, and I just find that such a useful concept and term. So I was glad you reintroduced that.
incredibly useful. And I'm going to go back in the intro. I'm going to pull Timothy Morton's definition so that we can really get that definition codified at the beginning of this for everyone. And I'll pull some passages from Hyperobjects. Well, thank you. I will have links to the book, but is there anywhere else where people can find you?
Twitter, or the platform formerly known as Twitter. Even though it's kind of a zombie shell of itself, I still spend a lot of time on there, like most journalists. And so there, I'm Ben_A_Goldfarb, and always welcome X's posted at me.
Fantastic. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait for people to read Crossings, to read Eager, and I am excited for whatever is next. I want to know if it has to do with salmon, but
there will be salmon in it. There will be infrastructure. I'm still working towards the next project. But if it's what I think it's going to be, it's going to have both salmon and infrastructure featuring prominently.
Great. I can't wait. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.